Welcome back to Inspired Content, where we'll be taking a look today at some of the less well known or less commonly read collections of fantasy short story collections. So we've done fantasy novels, science fiction short story collections, and now we're going to do the fantasy short story collections. Now, if it's up to me, I think we'll also have one at another later date for graphic novels, role playing games, and so on and so forth. Because we did movies as well. We did science fiction and fantasy movies. Um, I would like to do graphic novels and role playing games at least, possibly video games. But I'm thinking I'm going to be doing these once a month and focus on some other things for the rest of the month as I get back into this. I mean, if it's news to you, I've had a medical misdiagnosis that caused a lot of problems. I lost a good friend, um, and my living situation has been complicated and making it difficult for me to be able to do video content. But where we are right now is examining some of my favorite short story collections for fantasy fiction. Um, but I'm sticking to my set of rules that I used in the previous ones. These are different authors from each other. So, whereas my inclination might be to say this is one of my favorite books, and by the same author, there are other similar ones. I'm only allowed one source for each of them. So, like, for example, the first one on this list is Dragonlance Tales. Is it Tales? Tales 2 trilogy. So there are multiple Tales trilogies. There's 1 and 2, and then I think they did Dragons, which is another series of short stories. And there are definitely ones in each of them that I enjoy greatly, but I'm only allowed to have one entry from the Dragonlance series of short story collections in here. Now, I'm sort of going a little bit further than that with this because I have. Oh, come on. I'm about to lose everything here as it falls apart. So I have things like the Forgotten Realms, Realms of Infamy, and they have books like Realms of the Magic, Realms of Honor, or something like that, and they're short story collections too. But I feel like they are all from the Dungeons and Dragons TSR line of short fiction collections. So I can't really include any of those either. But this one is part of the Dragonlance setting. It's a collection of, this is Tales of the War of the Lance. Tales 2 Trilogy, Volume 3. So this is the third volume in the Tales 2 Trilogy. And this one, honestly, it's got some okay stories in here for some of the other stuff. But I think the one that sells this as the collection I chose is The Clockwork Hero by Jeff Grubb, which it's amusing as one of my favorite in the series. There are a few other good ones throughout the series itself of the short story collections, and I would be highly tempted to just, if you could, assemble them like Legos to get your favorite ones as a collection of all my favorite books or favorite short stories from the short story collections from the Dragonlance setting. But I don't get to make that choice. I'm not the editor, so I don't get to make that choice. But as a good sampler of the setting and telling you the reason this one's a good choice is because as the Tales 2 trilogies, I believe, were the Time of the Cataclysm, I can't remember what the other two were, but the third one is, this is volume 3. This takes place at the main timeline of the Dragonlance series. So it gives you snapshots from around the world of what's going on in that setting. And I think that's one of the reasons why I consider it to be one of the more valuable settings or valuable collections of stories for the setting. Because the Time of the Cataclysm would be a historical, the history of the setting, rather than contemporary to the main timeline of the setting. So that's volume 1. I'm probably going to run over on this one. Now, I have some in here that you've heard of, but you may have never had the experience of reading. This is a little big. It's probably going to start occluding my face a little bit here. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, written by Howard Pyle. Now this one's a little interesting because it's not just any collection of the Robin Hood stories. My experience of this was when I got into a Robin Hood kick when I was early teens. And I had a friend whose father had a bookshelf with this book in it that they let me borrow it, half amusedly because they expected that I wouldn't like it just because of the language in it. It's written in nearly a Shakespearean style with thine pate, like I smite thee on thine pate kind of talking from the characters. And I will admit, it took some effort to get past the first couple pages. I reread those first couple pages half a dozen times easy, just because comprehension of what they were saying was so uncertain. It was complicated. It was difficult to do. But once I got used to it, I got into the stories, and they were a fairly different telling of the character stories than you're used to hearing from fairy tales or like the Disney animal Robin Hood characters. So there are aspects of it that are definitely different and worth exploring just for their own sake. But also, I think it opened up a world for me so that a few years later when I went to college and I took a literature class, I was so much more accustomed to the language of older storytelling that I even surprised my professor with being able to clearly understand Shakespeare so much better. And my professor had some kind of like, we're not sure what they mean by this. And I'm like, no, it clearly means this, this, and this. I think that the opening sequence of Othello was something he was saying like, there's some interpretation you can do this way. And I'm like, no, Iago's speaking about it in these terms exactly. It's spelled out pretty clearly here. And he goes, wow, I never even realized that before. I'm like, yep, no, it's because I had a hobby that included reading things like I can't point to it. Yeah, no. Over here. There. All right. I'm calling it with that. This reversed image stuff is tricking me up. Okay, third on the list is another one that's probably archaic and you've heard of it, but the odds are good that you've probably never read any of the stories in this. Or you've heard of one or two of the stories, but never read the collection. And that's partly because there are multiple different versions of this collection, and not all of them share all the same stories. But I found this to be an amazing, fun collection of fiction, fantasy fiction. Um, Partly because of its mythic structure, similar to mythology from Greco-Roman times, um, but and maybe some elements similar to the sagas of what is it, the Eddas and the sagas of Norse mythology. There's a very strong mythological component to some of these stories. But there's also an element that's very similar to the Grimm brothers, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. And so it's a middle ground for some of that sort of storytelling. And I think I, I think with the Robin Hood and this in particular, and the next one coming up, they sow such fertile ground for playing with concepts. And part of it is also that you're getting different story components, different concepts than you otherwise would get from like standard run-of-the-mill fantasy fiction. Like there are elements in these stories that are uniquely different, and it's it's partly the stuff they left behind because these are some of the roots of fantasy fiction. So modern fantasy fiction took some elements from some of these works and carried them forward, but it's what they left behind that is fertile ground for playing with, I think, because it's valuable, interesting pieces of fictional settings and characters and concepts that they left behind that are worth playing with. All right, pull that out. Next in the mix, this one, this literal book I have somewhere in my storage. I was given this as a gift when I was in grade school. And I still have to say, some of the best art, the illustrations, and they have stories of knights from the time of King Arthur, Arthurian legend, and stories like the Cid. So they have these story elements in them, but interspersed between them are these little essays or historical notes about what the life and times of uh, knights were like. So, like, I think there's one in there about the, what was his name? Roland and Damascus swords and stuff like that. They're just these little clips that give context, but in a interesting storyteller sort of way about the context of the setting and objects and people in those times. And it's very interesting. It's one of my favorite books out there, and so it is technically a collection of short stories in the sense that each story is a self-contained story of knights, and then interspersed are story essays about elements of the time and place that these stories take place in. But it's not like a modern anthology of short fiction. So I may be cheating just a little bit here. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the more familiar story types. Thieves' World. This is another one that's sort of a classic in the short story collection shared universe. So this is a collection of short stories. This is the first one, I believe, and the first one. The second book in the series is called Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, which is the name of the pub that the story takes place in. You can see the banner on the wall and the illustration of the cover. And this is an interesting series. Each story is written by a different author, and many of them are well-known authors of fantasy and science fiction these days. I think this was done in the 70s, and my understanding is that some of these were early days of their career as writers. But I gotta tell you, man, it's tricky. This is a tricky setting to get into. So most of the characters are not good people. So the heroes are not good people. They're drug users and abusers and murderers, and the whole setting is a city that's used to be a major trade port between empires on a major trade route, and the trade route changed and bypassed their city, so the city is sort of dying out, and it's become a hiding place for ne'er-do-wells and evil people. And it's hard to imagine a city as foul and corrupt as this city is actually existing, because there's so much murder and mayhem within the city that your population would be wiped out on a regular basis just from the sheer murder and crime rate in the city. But the stories are well written, and the setting that they build through shared fiction, because that's the trick with this one, is they're not independent stories that take place independent of each other. There's overlap and interaction with the setting and the characters. Different authors are writing different parts of the setting through the eyes of different characters that they create, but it's all combined together to make a shared common setting that they all play in. And that's part of the reason why this is on the list, is that the brilliance of making those shared settings that they're all cooperating with. That was executed beautifully, and it's one of those things that I've only seen in net fiction, collaborative net fiction that people have done, other than Thieves' World and Wild Cards by James Martin, J.R.R. Martin. Yeah, Martin is the last name anyway. George R.R. Martin, there you go, that's who that is. Did Wild Cards. And that's another shared universe where events from one author's story interact with events from another author's story and the characters involved. That's a technique and a storytelling methodology that I don't see anymore. The only examples I've seen them in published works were Thieves' World and Wild Cards. Anyway, moving on from there, we'll go with Fantasy Worlds. Fantastic Worlds, Myths, Tales, and Stories. This is sort of me exploring sources of big collections. This is sort of like a scholarly reference collection of fantasy, myth, and legend story type. So this one is a good collection. It's a big beast. I think it's still got it over there somewhere. It's a hefty tome. I don't have a copy. I don't have the copy right in front of me. I should have had it right in front of me, but it is. It's like a dictionary. It's not a small book, but the collection of variety that they have inside of it is part of why it's on this list. It's not. I mean, we've gotten so used to it to a certain degree that many of these classic fantasy stories feel cliche and familiar, but they're only that way because we've gotten used to them. This is a good sort of collection for getting us. This is the what do they call it? The sample platter, the poo-poo platter at the Chinese restaurant. This is a good sample or an appetizer platter for fantasy fiction. Now this one's a little more what you'd consider the classic fantasy story collection, where there doesn't seem to be any through thread or any common story setting or any common themes. But it is one of those interesting spins on fantasy fiction with new variety. They're not the classic stories that we're most familiar with for the most part. They're new original fiction. I don't know if that's your thing, but Book of Wizards. Now this was a good find. It was a find I happened to actually I think this was a gift from somebody one Christmas. But the stories within this one were new fantasy in a way that was testing the waters to show what fantasy could be if we explored it a little more thoroughly. So it's leaving behind some of the formula that we're used to. I will probably at some point go back over some of these for specific stories that I thought were great out of them. This one's going to be a surprise for you. Chicks in Chainmail. Believe it or not, I believe if I remember the characterization of some of these stories, this is sort of feminist fantasy fiction. Sort of. It's not really, but it's tongue-in-cheek with the title of Chicks in Chainmail. This is a series of collections of short stories. And they all play a little bit of fun of being like, how dare you call us chicks or stuff like that. It's a little bit of fun with that, but um, I do think these were interesting stories of different types. It's not sword and sorcery to the same degree as so many of the stuff that came before. This is not Conan. This is not. It's not Dragonlance. But for its portrayal and having fun with the ideas and cliches, it makes the list. And I think last on the list is this series. I collected so many of these. There were a couple years where I eBay hunted for collections of this so that I could assemble. There are dozens of these books. And Marion Zimmer Bradley collected short stories from new and old authors together into each volume of female sword wielders and sorceresses in fantasy fiction. And I don't know what it was, but of the whole collection, there are very few stinkers. When you've got 24 volumes of a series of short story collections, and that's part of the reason I went for the collection so hard, is because it's a never-ending buffet of short stories. Like, if you have 12 or 13 stories per book and you have 24 books, you've got a lot of stories that you can play with. And so you would expect that with a story volume of that size, that half of them, a third of them will be decent stories and the rest of them will be like meh. No, I would say almost all the stories in every volume were worth reading, at least for one go. I mean, some of them are definitely worth rereading, and some of them are actually stories that were later expanded into novel series. There's one that's Kethri or something, like the equivalent of the fantasy version of Xena and Gabrielle exists in a series of books that started as stories in this collection somewhere. So I'm cheating a little bit because I'm counting this whole collection. But yeah, I'm not particularly choosing this volume. I'm choosing the Sword and Sorceress collection because this was just such a smorgasbord of amazing fantasy fiction. And that, I think, is going to have to be it for this. Because I don't know if I'll be able to upload this. I think they have a time limit on what I'm allowed to do for videos on here these days, and they've made this harder for me to do. But that's it for the fantasy short fiction. I believe I got them all right. Sword and Sorceress, Chicks in Chainmail, come on, Book of Wizards, Wizards Dozen, Fantastic Worlds, Thieves Worlds, Arabian Nights, King Arthur, Robin Hood, Dragonlance. I think that's my whole list. If there are books of fantasy short fiction that you think are your favorites and I should look into, let me know. Because that is one thing I will say. Anthology collections of fantasy fiction are harder to come by than anthology series of science fiction. I don't know why. I don't know how it came to be that way. But I've I found fewer recommendations of fantasy short fiction. So if you know of any that you think would be fun to check out, let me know. Alrighty, I gotta call it here. Otherwise, I'm never going to be able to upload this video.